hello. Introduce us to your audiences, please.
Hello, I'm very glad to be here. I'm a faculty member at Purdue University, and my area is counseling psychology, and I specifically focus in the area of grief, loss, and death and dying issues.
And we know that there's been a lot of loss and a lot of grief in terms of COVID-19, and I'd like to speak to two topics. One are the people who've lost loved ones, and also those who have survived, but maybe are mourning a life that they might have previously had and don't know whether they will get this back, because we're starting to learn that there could be long-term or it's very likely there are long-term complications. So first, would you speak about bereavement in terms of family members who've lost a loved one?
Absolutely, which is the primary focus here, right? The primary losses, the significant death losses that have happened in this pandemic. And I would also mention the groups that have been differentially affected. Those of minoritized, racial ethnic groups have definitely experienced higher percentages of death losses, which I think is a really critical factor to highlight. Grief is very different than what we often hear, what we often experience in terms of societal messages. As a society, we tend to think very narrowly about what grief must or should look like, when really it's actually very unique and specific to each person. We often hear grief maybe that it moves in stages, and actually what the research indicates and what we know in my field today is that it's much more complex, much more dynamic than that. It tends not to move in sort of a linear, stepwise kind of way. It's very unique for each individual person. So even thinking about grief being equal to sadness is really not a great fit, because we know that grief is emotional. Even emotions that are not sadness, it's cognitive, it's physical, it's social, it's spiritual, it's all of those elements of how we function, and it affects really all those levels. And then it affects each person uniquely and individually within their particular context, within their particular cultural, background, their particular communities. There's a lot of variability, and it's really important, I think, for people to hear that their grief will be very unique to them, and that messages that indicate a very narrow or specific expression of grief are actually quite problematic. They can lead people to judge their own experience when their own experience is quite natural for who they are.
Can you give an example of maybe someone that you've maybe spoken to about this in terms of the uniqueness of their grieving process?
Absolutely. So if we think about individuals who tend to be more cognitive or more physiological in their grief, so we might have someone who focuses very much on what the loved one's life meant and works to very much make sense of that life in a cognitive sort of way. We also have individuals who grieve often actively. I think about a father whose toddler died, who kept a special rock in his pocket every day. And that was a really important connection to his child who died, but he wasn't talking about it, he wasn't emoting about it, but he was very much focused on grief and very much focused on remembering his child who had died.
And you had mentioned that everyone's grieving process is different, and it doesn't necessarily come in specific stages in terms of research. Can you just elaborate a little bit more on that, because it is so unique to people?
Yes, absolutely. So when we think about grief, rather than considering it being a stepwise sort of stage sort of process, we really want to think about it as a death being not an event, but really a life-changing experience. So often grievers will consider absolutely their life before the death in contrast to their life after the death. When we experience the death of someone very close to us, it can really shatter our understanding of how the world works, how we make sense of who we are as people. And so this whole idea of making sense or reconstructing our understanding of ourselves and reconstructing our understanding of how the world works is a much more accurate sort of way to be thinking about grief, and how as individuals we tend almost to live in stories, and that when we're grieving we need to kind of rewrite our story moving forward. You know, that person was a primary character if we use, you know, that perspective, and without them in our story we have to rewrite the outlines we have for those future chapters, which is a much more unique and sort of capturing the idiosyncratic nature of grief in thinking about it through processes rather than thinking about it as a particular stepwise sort of process. Mm-hmm.
And we've talked about, so this father having a rock in his pocket that just reminded him, or just the example of having a rock in his pocket. And are there unhealthy ways to grieve? I mean, one of the things I just in my own research was that people continue to talk about the person in the first person, but in fact they're gone. So what would you say to that?
I would say, in general, my perspective is that the challenges that individuals experience in their grief are more often caused by society than they are caused by an individual grieving in any sort of problematic way. My understanding and my belief is that our society, and actually many cultures, although there are many who are better than we are in the US, create problems for grieving people, you know, provide messages of judgment in a way that really internalize for grieving people that they're not doing it correctly, which then complicates their grief even more than if they would have been able to naturally experience what was fitting for them. I think there are certain situations where individuals may have pre-existing sort of challenges related to relationships, where when someone very significant in their life dies, those complications can then be connected very much to their grief. To me, grief by its very nature is normative. It's the natural response to a loss. And so when there are individuals who have grief that is a catalyst for depression or is a catalyst for post-traumatic stress disorder, those things can happen. Grief and death losses can be catalysts for those mental health kinds of conditions. But in general, grief itself is quite normative. It is a natural response by definition. I think individuals who talk in the first person, there is more processing that they're doing then, right? About the story and about the need to rewrite that story. There can be a holding on to the past and a holding on to what was. And that really does require the need to take in the experience and the reality of the death, and then being able to rewrite again that future story. And you know, that those are important factors to consider. But again, to me, grief is normative, but a death loss can be a catalyst for other kinds of conditions.
Right. And so, I mean, you just have to give yourself time. I mean, you can't skip it. It's, so it's circling back to, what you said.
And I think when we say skip it, right, then I think you're right. I mean, grief is something that people need to experience. It's very natural, but it's also very unique. So sometimes to some individuals, someone who looks like they're skipping it may really just be expressing their grief in a very different way, right? We have narrowly defined grief as talking and expressing and crying and emoting. And the research indicates not at all are those pieces necessary or required for individuals to grieve effectively. Many times, again, individuals will grieve in very active, very cognitive, very outward sorts of ways that don't tend to look like, grief expressions that society might expect. And oftentimes individuals don't believe themselves that those are expressions of grief. So often when I talk to grievers, say, well, I haven't grieved, or I never grieved, or I'm not grieving correctly. And then we get down to some of the more specific elements, like, look at this fundraiser that you did for your loved one who died. That was an absolute expression of grief in a way that we would call sort of altruistic instrumental grief rather than intuitive grief, as my colleagues Doka and Martin talk about. That it's really, there are different patterns of expression. And I think that's very normalizing, I think very important for grievers to hear that there is no one right way.
And I want to circle back to what you were speaking about in terms of PTSD. We're seeing PTSD, new statistics had come out in terms of PTSD and COVID-19 survivors, these sort of long haulers who are sort of grieving this life that they may not get back, and sort of looking to the future and what might happen, because we can grieve a job loss, we can grieve a relationship. I mean, these things can be just as effective. So would you be able to speak to what we were talking about in terms of this specific case, these COVID-19 patients that might be grieving a life that won't look the same?
Well, and I think you put it very well, Mary, and I completely agree with you. I mean, a significant part of the work that I do is focused on what we call non-death losses, right? Those losses that are very much a part of our daily life, from micro to macro sort of losses. And you really are talking about the grieving of a way of being, a way of moving and functioning in the world. And one of the things that comes to mind for me in that is it can be very helpful for people to be able to really identify all of the losses that are part of that kind of situation. Sometimes people can believe that they're overreacting if they think about it as being just one loss. But if they really sort of challenge themselves to identify all the parts of their life that are now different and all of the losses, rather than being a process that brings them down, it can be a process that really is comforting, provides insight, is very, again, normalizing in a way, in connection with the depth of what they are experiencing. Many changes, most life changes, involve both losses and gains as a piece of them. I can't say what the gains would be here because the primary focus, of course, initially would be the losses that were a part of this kind of shifting from one sort of lifestyle, one sort of way of being to another. But I want to highlight that it's not just one loss, right? There are many sorts of losses. And I do believe that it is a grieving process, and recognizing and acknowledging it as a grief process can also be quite helpful. How is it then that I reimagine my life and the way I will move in the world, right? How do I make sense of this new way of being in the world? Again, going back to the assumptions about how things would be, and knowing that they can't be the same, but they could perhaps still be, there could be still positive elements, productivity, a continued story that really matters, even though it's not the same story.
And last thoughts, what would you like to tell people who are suffering and grieving?
Yeah, I mean, another point would be really that, although again, it may sound discouraging, grief doesn't really end. I think one of my favorite quotes is from, a great philosopher of our time, Keanu Reeves, who said, "Grief never ends, it changes shape." And to me, the spatial sort of message there is also quite powerful, that it's not, again, an event. We are different in our grief than we were before. And that can be really empowering to know that grief is actually a reflection of love and attachment. And so as we grieve, it's because of our love and our attachment that grief continues. Just because someone dies, it doesn't mean that we don't stop loving them. And so our grief doesn't end either. We move to a place where we can function, where we can move you know, and be in the world. I often have grievers, and I've heard grievers say to me, you know, I have shifted from a place where my grief no longer owns me, where I own my grief. And I think that's really what we're hoping for, right? Is for people to be in a place where they own their grief. But, you know, they often say, you know, you can't define me by my grief, but if you don't understand my grief, you can't know me.
Well, thank you so much for your time. This is going to help a lot of people, and really appreciate your contribution to this research.
Yeah, I really appreciate being here. I really am so glad that you're doing this story. And I do hope there are elements of help here. So.
Absolutely. All right. Well, take care. Okay. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, Mary.